Thank you very much. Like I was very graciously introduced, I'm Ehren Osborne, and welcome to my talk, Please, oh please, stick to the RFCs. Just a brief intro about me. I'm a penetration tester for KPMG based in Leeds. I'm Dunk's owner, more on that in a minute. I'm a huge web application fan, as you can probably see from my Burp Suite shirt. I'm a Czech team member, Welsh, originally from South Wales, and if anyone's seen my previous talks, still a very big HouseMD fan. I actually did this talk previously in Leeds, and this was around mid-June, and there are references, obviously, to my cat, who I talk about profusely. So I just had a little bit of a size update that I'd just thought I'd just swing in there since my last talk. He's gained about maybe 1.5 kilos since, so that's quite quite something. So please stick to the RFCs is both my technical recommendation and plea for my sanity when testing. But before I get into the RFCs, my annoyances in applications that don't follow them and the vulnerabilities that I've witnessed as a result, I want to go back to November 2025 when the idea for this talk first came to me. So, for the context, I feel like I need to set the scene for you. Yeah, that's better. Just for reference, this is right outside the KPMG Leeds office, and a slightly different update from my cat's size update. Just off the screen to the right there, in between the last talk and this one, me and John Campbell over there actually saw a fully dead person just to the right by that restaurant. So there's the context of Leeds for you. So to keep it back on track, in the Leeds CDS contingent, we love to go for coffee in the morning generally. And while walking, our conversations varied from kind of like tired ramblings to what tests we've been up to in the week. At the time, I was talking with my manager, Josh. For context, he is a CSTL app and is usually my go-to for any app-related discussions and questions. We got to talking about the app I was testing this week and how it was just basically nonsensical. Essentially, the main point of frustration was that the application was responding to any request I sent with a 200 OK, suggesting that my intended request was successful. However, if my request was wrong in some way, it would return JSON in the body of the response with the genuine error message. The reason for this was most likely that the front end was acting as like a simple proxy for the back end to actually process the request. Now, does this work? I guess. Does it make fuzzing harder? Absolutely. And should the developers seek other employment? Maybe. But while this wasn't something that actually affected testing, it got Josh and I into the topic of this talk, applications that don't follow the RFCs. As app testing is slightly more niche, Josh seemed excited that someone else had finally pointed out how most apps that you test don't respond in ways that should be expected in line with these RFCs. So this will probably be a perfect time to address the big ticket item, the humble RFC. Out of curiosity here, does everyone roughly know what RFC actually stands for? Yeah? No? A mix of the both? It stands for Request for Comment. They are documents that essentially detail the standards for how protocols work. They look like this, and before you ask if any more of the budget could be allocated to the design, no, because it's simply perfect. Naturally, as a humble web app tester, the RFC that is most interesting is that of the HTTP protocol. Now, once again, my colleagues are probably cringing at the thought of me ranting about HTTP 1.1, the specifications and such. Luckily for them, this is an informative and serious talk. So what will this talk entail? And more importantly, how will I try to keep you entertained while talking about the RFCs? The answer is always examples and war stories. While this talk will be leaning on the side of quotes from these white papers, I will also drift into applications that simply make no sense. For the actual content, I will start with my favorite RFCs, what kind of things are covered in them, with some fun information you can hopefully bring to your next test. Why sticking to the RFCs improve the consistency in applications and hence are easier to secure, and give you some tests I've conducted that were just too surreal in their design not to mention. When writing this talk, it was hard to narrow down which RFCs to talk about, as there are so many. So I decided to immediately retract my statement about not giving HTTP 1.1 related rants and start there. The current HTTP 1.1 RFC is RFC 9112, published in June of 2022. It heavily details how the HTTP 1.1 protocol should operate. So why is this interesting? Well, let's take a look at some examples. First, we have the content length and transfer encoding conflict. This is one of the more famous points of recent times in the RFC. Essentially, HTTP 1.1 allows you to specify the length of a request with either the content length or transfer encoding headers. The RFC tells us that if a message is received with both a transfer encoding and a content length header field, the transfer encoding overrides the content length. Well, a large portion of request smuggling stems from this statement not being implemented consistently across machines. Well, now that we kind of have the obligatory request smuggling reference, how about something that is a bit more grounded in regular pen testing, host header discrepancies? The RFC states that a server must respond with a 400 bad request status code to any HTTP 1.1 request message that lacks a host header field, and to any request that contains more than one host header field line or a host header field with an invalid field value. Now, from personal experience, this is very rarely implemented. A lot of applications that I test will just silently drop one of the host headers or assume because it has interpreted it correctly that the next hop in the request journey will. However, this attitude is what leads to host header-related vulnerabilities. The reverse proxy may value the first instance of the host header, whereas the back-end component, which processes the request, may value the last instance of the host header, resulting in sensitive information being retrieved. Now, I could spend a lot of time going over RFC detail, but that would take far too long and get a bit repetitive, so a rapid-fire round felt a little bit more appropriate. RFC 5341 specifies the acceptable structure of phone numbers. From the graphic, you can see there are optional parameters which many applications that implement phone-related functionality don't expect. This can be on just general websites when you're creating accounts, when you're getting SMS OTP requests, that kind of thing. So specifying a parameter in the end could be an injection point for XSS or even manipulating the end destination for an SMS OTP. Onto a personal favorite of mine, RFCs 5321 and 5322 specify email-related formatting. Some fun things to consider. Firstly, the local part of a mailbox must be treated as case sensitive. Oh, I've knocked it out, sorry. Perfect. The local part of a mailbox must be treated as case sensitive. Therefore, SMTP implementations must take care to preserve the case of mailbox local parts. In particular, for some hosts, the user Smith is different from the user Smith. This means that a correctly implemented RFC could have bob@test.com and bob@test.com as different emails. They should be treated as such. Additionally, these are all completely valid email addresses. Bob with a comment at test.com, 2 quotations with a space at test.com, and bob plus bob at test.com. As a side note on email parser discrepancies, I highly recommend checking out Gareth Hayes' research on email splitting attacks because it exploits all of these components on so many levels to do so many cool things. Now we've seen some interesting examples. The question is, what was the common denominator? If you guessed parser discrepancies, you would be correct. Especially relating to how they don't really plan for a lot of these edge cases. Why does sticking to the RFCs help improve application security? This is a loaded question, but I think it really can just be broken down into 2 sections. Firstly, it removes the risk of parser discrepancies. If the RFC can be agreed and applied between all components which interact in some way, if we go back to the kind of transfer encoding and content length, that's about kind of applying an equal solution over your reverse proxy, proxies, CDNs, load balancers, and of course the actual backend that processes the request. And secondly, it stops vulnerabilities arising from edge cases that are less common, but still acceptable according to the RFC, which lead to exceptional circumstances, something that's kind of been flagged in the more recent OWASP that we've seen, where like I said, with the phone numbers and the emails, a lot of these parsers just don't understand that these are capabilities, and when they actually reach different systems, all hell can kind of break loose. Now that we've kind of seen some RFC content and you've heard me tell you the risks associated, I feel like it is only fair I share some cool tests that will both aid my points and question the integrity of a couple of applications in the wild. Recently, I was testing a very, very, very old application. It had been tested every year, so it was quite hardened despite the old software. One thing I noticed was that the application had a link to a help document with the URL including the port, example.com:443/help. This struck me as a little bit strange, so I decided to supply an arbitrary host header. The first thing I tried was the classic test.com, and it was reflected. Now, this is risky in itself, but what else could we supply in the host header? Well, the RFC is very strict about this. As you can see, there is a set format and a list of accepted characters that can be used. So I guess a little bit of an arbitrary question, but do you think it accepted script alert1 script as the host header? Yes. Of course it did, yeah. It was relatively trivial to break out of the tag, as the application just simply wasn't anticipating the need to sanitize a host header. As this is technically self-XSS, I bet you're wondering about the risk. My manager, Nathan, wondered about that also. The truth is that it's most likely a low, unless there is a caching server in front of it, which would store the response. As it was a login page, it's probably a higher chance of being cached, because it's more typically static. However, this could not be explored during the testing window, so we'll never truly know, like most caching vulnerabilities that we say could exist. Moving on to a higher risk finding, which is currently pending as a CVE still after more months. I was testing a piece of enterprise software where part of the functionality was to generate reports. These reports were returned as PDFs, with very little actually sent in the user's request to retrieve them. Like any other test, I ran param-miner, which after a while returned a hidden URL parameter, MIME type. Now, for anyone that tests web apps regularly, you will associate the phrase MIME type with content types. Once again, RFC has a strict definition, who would have guessed? It states that the content type header field indicates the media type of the associated representation, either the representation enclosed in the message content or the selected representation is determined by the message semantics. Who knows what that means, but in plain English, it means the content type labels the data format of the HTTP message body. So the other side knows what to expect and how to process it. The second arbitrary question I have is, do you think the application accepted text/HTML, script alert 1 script, in a very intelligible and beautiful URL encoded format as a valid content type, obviously with the new lines included for a good bit of CRLF injection? Absolutely it did. There is no question about the risk here. CRLF is a step above XSS, and such, when injected into the header of a request, allowing you to inject headers, malicious content that can be sent over HTTP, and at the worst, response splitting, which is quite topical given the recent Black Hat talks and research on CRLF-powered desynchronization. Unquestionably a high, I would say, if not more, depending on the kind of architecture that's been set up around it. And just to warn, like most talks that I do, there is a mini rant coming. Because when I first reported this, the company said, in quote, that it is probably expected functionality, as the MIME type header was documented. But then they moved on once I argued to them about this. They said, actually, it's not expected functionality, but since it's reflected, we don't really see any risk. So the fun part about that last point was that on the same software, on the same endpoint, there was a reflected XSS vulnerability that did get assigned a CVE. So best believe I emailed a storm back to them and go back to exploring the issue they did. This has been pending for a while, and you would have thought that they would just sanitize the input based off of an allow list of maybe 5 available content types to get a PDF document converted into. But I think they're most likely getting paid by the hour. With that last example, we kind of come to the end of the talk. While it may seem like a boring recommendation, if there are any prospective web application testers out there, I would highly recommend having a read of the RFCs to understand applications on a deeper level and discover some cool features to kind of try on your future tests. I hope you learned something about the RFCs and that I could make them slightly more interesting than they would appear. So I guess with that, my final words of advice would kind of be to please, oh please, stick to the RFCs. Thank you very much. If there are any comments and you are Glaswegian, I might have to get John over there to translate them. But apart from that, thank you very much.